I'm afraid I don't have much time to tell you this, so I must be brief. I know I am not a perfect man. I have done many bad things. Terrible things. But I'm not a bad person. I don't go out of my way to intentionally commit these sins. It just seems that bad things always have a way of finding me. I'm chronically in the wrong place at the worst time. But this time is different. I am innocent. Even the court system agrees with me, as I was fully acquitted and released from police custody yesterday. Or, at least I think it was yesterday. I'm not really sure of the time at the moment. You see, on my way home, a series of terrorizing events led me to where I am now, huddled in a filthy storage closet, holding my breath while hiding for my life. I can hear the footsteps creaking across the dim room on the other side. It'll only be a matter of time until he realizes I am in here. If he doesn't find me, I'll make a break for it and head straight to the police. But if I'm not so lucky, well, I'm frantically typing this into the shattered screen of my phone. I'll cue it in my emails to send off as soon as my phone is brought back into signal, one way or another. I need someone, anyone, to know what is happening here, and to catch this lunatic. As I mentioned, it all started the night I was acquitted of my crimes. It had been a long and ugly court battle, and I was beyond elated to have my name cleared. It had been nearly 2 months since I had been allowed the simple comfort of sleeping in my own bed. You see, no one had been willing to pay my bond, so I had been in county jail for the remainder of my trial. But all of that was finally over, and I chose to revel in the fresh air as I walked the last several blocks home rather than catch a cab. It was then that I first noticed something was amiss. I could have sworn that I had seen a man following me. I just caught a glimpse of him, but I was certain of it. If it had been just some ordinary man, perhaps I wouldn't have even thought twice about it. But there was just something off about him. He seemed so familiar. Yes, that's right. I have seen this man before. I hadn't made the connection until now, but I am certain it's the same man. He was in the courtroom. He was there, watching my trial. That tall, gaunt-looking man. Despite having what I assume was a darker olive complexion, he appeared quite the unnatural sickly pale, and he had these striking blue eyes that bore into me with such accusation I couldn't bear to hold the gaze. His long black curls looked wild and unkempt, as if they hadn't been washed for days. But it was his attire that was more bizarre yet. He wore a long, dark robe that seemed out of place in this century. It was really quite odd. I'm not even sure how he got in there, as he didn't seem to be a member of the jury, and as far as I could tell, he wasn't related to the family of the alleged victim. I get shivers up my spine just thinking about the way he looked at me. I've never seen such calm, collected hatred concentrated into a simple glance before. I suppose that should have set off alarm bells in my head right away, but how could I have known any better? I had never seen that man before in my life, and for all I was concerned, he had never seen me either. But I was wrong. He had seen me before. He knew exactly who I was and all about my history of chronic bad decisions. When I saw him scurry out of sight through my peripheral vision, I should have made a break for it. I should have ran home, locked the doors, and immediately phoned the police. But you know what they say about hindsight. No, instead of fleeing for my life like a much wiser man would have, I let curiosity get the better of me and turned around to see where he had slipped away to. The sun was just beginning to set, but there was still enough light left in the day for me to feel confident to round the corner into the alleyway in which my pursuer had vanished. The alley was narrow and stank like piss. No doubt it made a home base for some local vagabonds. Other than a few dumpsters and an abandoned shopping cart, there was nothing to be seen. I had just begun to turn back out onto the street when I heard a soft clatter coming from the shadows. In an instant, I had whipped around to search for the source of the noise. It was then that I noticed the shadowy figure leaning against one of the brick facades. Just over 6 feet tall, I immediately recognized that strange, out-of-place robe. Just then, the now rapidly setting sun cast a gleam of light over my observer's face, once again revealing those deep blue, hatred-filled eyes. The expression he wore seemed to mock me, daring me to confront him, so I gladly obliged. Another horrific mistake. As I charged him, I did not see the ever-so-thin wire stretching from the bottom of the shopping cart to the adjacent dumpster. My ankle was immediately filled with the searing pain as the wire dug into my flesh, sending me crashing to the ground. Before I could regain my composure, the man was on top of me, shoving a rag over my mouth and nose. It was a familiar scent. Chloroform. By the time I woke up, the sun had completely set. The only reason I knew this was because of the dusty old window across the room, from which I could just barely make out the night sky. It took me a moment to come to my senses, but when I did, I immediately knew something was horribly wrong. I was in some sort of dimly lit room. I tried to look around, but found it difficult, as I had been strapped to a gurney. From what I could gather from glimpses through my peripheral vision, it looked as though I were in the middle of someone's sitting room. It was completely dark, save for the flickering of an old box television on a rolling cart. Despite most of the furnishings remaining in good condition, I doubted anyone had actually lived here for a very long time. I tugged at my restraints, but found them to be secure. Just as I was about to panic, I heard footsteps approaching, accompanied by the squeal of ungreased wheels. Not knowing what to do, I laid as still as I could manage and pretended that I had not yet regained consciousness. This either worked or the loony decided to play along, because he did not disturb me. Instead, he continued to push whatever it was that was making that horrible racket until it came to a stop right beside me. It wasn't until he began cooing over it, as if it were a frightened child, that I realized I must not be alone in this predicament. Through the madman's soft babblings, I could hear the muffled sobs of another grown man. I was too focused on attempting to keep my breath steady and remain undetected that I didn't hear exactly what my captor was saying. However, based on his demeanor, it sounded as if he were attempting to comfort the now pitifully weeping man beside me. The sound of the poor man's apparent agony was too much for me to maintain my resolve. For a split second, I inhaled suddenly before frantically attempting to regain my steady breathing pattern. I broke out into a cold sweat when I heard the madman grow silent. I closed my eyes tight as I heard tender footfalls approach me. A gloved hand gingerly rested upon my temple for a moment before quickly withdrawing at the sound of a shrill cry from the man beside me. Clicking his tongue, I heard the madman leave my side once again. After tending to the man to my left for a few more minutes, my captor announced that something was nearly ready, and the man beside me didn't have much longer to wait. He then promptly left the room, his dark robe flowing ominously behind him. I took this moment to try and find out as much as I could. I tried my restraints again, and found that the ones holding my head in place were a bit loose. After a bit of finagling, I was able to completely turn my head to the side to gaze upon my involuntary companion. It was then that the true horror of the situation struck me. The man across from me lay strapped to a similar gurney. He appeared to be stripped of his clothing, as I could see his bare flesh rising and falling in an unsteady panic. Across the pale, heaving canvas, I could make out a crisscrossing grid of pen marks. The dashed lines were laid about in a way that highlighted certain parts of the torso. A chilling thought sent a shiver down my spine. The marks seemed to map out all the man's vital organs. Did our captor intend to carve them out? No, I couldn't panic yet. I had to keep my head if I was going to make it out with my life. I turned once more to glance at the poor soul beside me, and that's when I noticed him returning my gaze. He looked exhausted and stared at me through tear-stained eyes. He wore an expression of utter hopelessness and defeat, and he barely even reacted to my presence. Since my unfortunate friend made no attempt to start a conversation, I decided to make the first move. I tried to ask him his name, but all that came out was a harsh croak. I took a moment to clear my dried-out throat before trying again. This time, I was able to produce a few words. "Hey," I muttered. The man's eyes came to a focus on me, but he still said nothing. "Hey," I repeated again. "Do you know where we are? What the hell is all of this? That man, do you know anything about him?" Finally, that seemed to snap him to attention. He began shifting uncomfortably and motioning to the door from which the man had exited a moment ago with his eyes. I was confused by this and didn't understand why he didn't just answer me, so I asked again. He furrowed his brow and then opened his mouth to respond, but all that came out was a muffled cry of sorts. It was then that I noticed the stained gauze shoved in his mouth. He struggled with it for a moment before finally spitting it out, the soiled white cotton landing unceremoniously on his shaking chest. I couldn't help but let my mouth drop in horror. The poor man. Someone had all but removed his tongue. It had to have been our captor, as the wound still looked fairly fresh. Oddly enough, the incision looked quite precise. It was a clean cut with minimal trauma to the surrounding areas. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill psychopath with a butcher knife. Whoever had abducted us was clearly some sort of professional with medical training. The man tried desperately to communicate with me, but the lack of his oral appendage made it almost impossible to understand. He kept mouthing the same few syllables, but I had no idea what they meant. However, within a few moments I found his manic mumblings turn into frantic screams as the door to our holding chamber opened once more. I threw my head back into its original position and resumed feigning unconsciousness.